Hello, and thank you for joining me today for the briefing on persistent absence. Apologies that due to the technical difficulties, this isn't as interactive as we'd originally planned, but I hope that you'll still find it useful as I take you through the slides today. So we're going to have a look at persistent absence very briefly and just revisit what this means and what some of the good practice and resourcing pointers might look like. And we're also then going to apply these into the balance of our current climate and the support that's out there today. As Worcestershire schools, you are continuing to do an amazing job in addressing attendance, and anyone that would have already had a look at the head teacher briefing will know that the last data shared within that suggests that attendance in our county is higher than national average and our statistical neighbours. I'm certain that in the current climate, for lots of us working in schools, it might not feel that way, but please don't underestimate what a long way you've come and a fantastic job that you are doing to all continue in such adverse circumstances to promote attendance and work on it. It's a real difficult one more than ever in our current climate, and I commend each and every school because I know in speaking to you how much effort you are putting in to make that happen. So just clarifying the definition of persistent absence as it stands at the moment, it's 10% or more of possible sessions that any pupil has that are missed. And just to look at what that might look like during a year, in September, 4 weeks back at school, it can be as little as 2 days off. We'll put somebody into a persistent absence category. But by the end of an academic year, it kind of equates to 19 days. That's nearly 4 weeks missed of school, or roughly about half a day every week. So you can see the impact that that has, and that's the minimum amount to get classed as persistent absent. So why is addressing attendance important? I won't need to go through all these and tell you. You can read a lot of those for yourselves, and they won't come as any great surprise for anyone working with attendance or in education generally. But just to pick up a couple of the points there, persistent absence is often symptomatic. It's a really good marker for alarm bells sometimes. Things like, is a child a young carer that we don't know about? Are there attachment or anxiety issues, or are there issues in school that have happened recently that we can kind of nip in the bud? And also just to point out that often our persistent absentees are, because they're unseen, they're often our silent children in some ways. And it's just to kind of reiterate that our maintained safeguarding duties are there, and they are potentially vulnerable students. They might not be in a vulnerable group as you would recognise in school as any other vulnerable group, but purely by the fact that they're not there makes them vulnerable in some ways. So looking at good practice, and again, a lot of you will be doing all of this already, but it's just sometimes helpful, I think, to ask ourselves and our schools, how are we doing them and how are we getting on with these? Can we reflect on what we are doing and if it is having a positive effect as we'd want it to? So I'm going to quickly whiz through these and just ask the questions really that you can take back and ask of yourselves also. So the whole school shared approach. Does everybody know in your school what their roles and responsibilities are? Does everyone help and assist in that escalation and celebration of attendance? Or does it feel sometimes that that's just something that the attendance officer deals with? And although none of us mean to do that, I think it's very easy that sometimes we don't see the other roles in attendance within schools that would really assist and help in kind of promotion of that. Your data, it goes without saying, you will know probably more so than ever at the moment what your data is saying to you. Do you know the main reasons for absence? Do you know what the patterns are telling you? And that's just really to look at your resourcing. Is what you think is happening in your school around attendance actually the thing that is? Or is it something that you need to refocus on because actually the data is telling you something that you might not have been aware of? Communication and relationships. So how does your school communicate to parents about attendance generally? Do they do that in a positive way? Or do we only do that when actually there's a problem and there's an issue and it needs resolving? Are those things working? Or might we need to look at these in a different way? And an example I can give of that is if you've got a kind of letter or telephone process. If you're sending 3 or 4 letters and you're not getting a response, or you're phoning daily and not getting the comeback, then you might need to look, we all might need to look at what else we do, because clearly if that isn't working, we need to find another way. So moving on to barriers, you will know if you're working in attendance already that telling a child or a young person or a parent that they just need to be in school over and over and over again is not going to be the thing that enables them to come into school. So we really need to unpick what the barriers might be, find out what they are, and help to support with finding solutions around these. Pupil voice is really important. Attendance, we often think about in terms of parental responsibility, and yes, it is, but we also perhaps just need to refocus a bit more sometimes on capturing what that pupil is actually saying to us about attendance and what it looks like for them. Utilising support. You will all have the most fantastic staff already working in your schools. And sometimes if you've got a Senko or a health and wellbeing champion or somebody in school that has a really good relationship with the family, it might be that they can be the person that brokers and mediates the attendance conversation that perhaps the school attendance officer might need. And that's really powerful. If you've got somebody there that's already got a good relationship with parents, then you might find that actually that's quite a quick and easy win to get in. External signposting. The briefings from Worcestershire Children's First will tell us of the initiatives that are available and we know about within the county as they come out. I appreciate the amount of information coming out is kind of relentless and ever changing, but please do keep an eye out for that, because it is updated. Obviously, as we learn more, things will come out and to inform schools. You'll also maybe have things in your own districts, and often your governors or communities might be really helpful and just looking out for those kind of things for you, that again might be available and are readily able for you to tap into to support with attendance issues. I think we kind of have to be realistic about setting milestones and expectations. If a pupil is persistently absent and has had quite a lot of time off, statistically, it will not be possible for them to achieve 100% by the end of the year, because it just won't equate. So we just need to be mindful of what targets we're setting, and I would always suggest that perhaps you do that on a weekly, fortnightly or monthly basis that actually gives that child some immediate feedback. It doesn't set them something that's impossible. And it also celebrates the really small successes that actually in the long term are really important. Equally with parents, you know, attendance, parents' feedback will often be that they only hear about it when it's something negative. And again, perhaps that's something that as a school, you might just want to have a look at in terms of how we celebrate kind of successes, however small they might be. And outcomes, the so what effect. Again, you know, are we doing the things that are making the difference? And if we're still doing them and they're not having the effect, then we might just need to reassess some of that and look at doing things perhaps a little bit differently. So it's just kind of all of those things I know schools will be doing anyway. It's just perhaps asking the question of, is it working? And if not, is there something we need to tweak or do slightly differently? If you haven't had a chance to see this yet, it did come out early September, I think, along with a whole load of other info, which I appreciate came out to schools at that time. And if you have had a chance to look at it, that's great. If you've seen it but haven't really had a chance to go through it, I would suggest 5 minutes just to dip back in, because there's some really useful guidance and ideas in here, and feedback from those schools that have managed to have a look is saying that they have found it really useful. So that might be something that you can go back and have a look at if you haven't recently. Available resources, so looking at kind of what the stance is from the DFE, it does recognise, as you can see there, that it's an important area of school improvement. And if you're not already, you may need to just consider whether pupil premium funding or COVID related funding more recently is something there's a resource that maybe you can think about tapping into as a school. The DFE framework also just has a few more pointers on ideas about resourcing. And again, I'm certain that this won't be anything new that you're not doing already in schools. We've already covered some of it in good practice. But just picking out perhaps one example there that I've recently seen governors involved in attendance panels, celebratory events, and it seems to really help to raise the profile of attendance and understanding the shared responsibility that it's everybody's to try and kind of assist with. I understand fully at the moment things are looking very different in our current climate to what we'd ordinarily do to celebrate persistent good attendance. But I think all the same, there are still some wins we can have there. We might just need to look at doing them creatively and perhaps virtually that we wouldn't have had to consider before. And again, just tapping into, are you utilising external or independent services and partners as much as you can? You know, it's the final part on resources that I'm going to go through today, but just to consider if you haven't already, or to reconsider if it's not something you ordinarily do, but you feel as a school now might be helpful. All of those providers are listed there as examples. There will be others, but yeah, just to tap in if you feel you need to for some of the cases that you might be dealing with that are really tricky. So in relation to the ideal about persistent absence and good practice and how we ordinarily tackle it, I fully appreciate that currently in the climate we're working in, it's really difficult to find that balance because yes, we want to promote attendance as we always have and we always will, but at the same time, we don't want to encourage children into school where it's not safe to be there and goes against public health guidance. So it's really difficult, and I appreciate that in schools that changes weekly or daily in what is happening with your bubbles, etc. I think, you know, we want to encourage regular attendance. I think we have to be really mindful that the global pandemic that we're in means that we can't just carry on as we were before, because actually a lot of the things that we were doing will not be relevant or appropriate to do in the same manner now. Please be assured, however, there won't be a school in the county or probably the country without some really tricky cases and some really tricky scenarios going on. There won't be a one-size-fits-all answer either, because each and every school within Worcestershire will have a slightly different backdrop in the fact that some will have bubble closures, some won't, some will have a lot of staffing issues, some won't. So what I'm going to do today is just go through some ideas, but they will be for you as schools to kind of pick and choose which will be relevant for you perhaps at which time, and also to say that I won't be able to provide all of the answers, but at the end I can provide some information that might be helpful for you to tap into, or contacts that can be made that if you're still finding it really difficult to get through tricky cases, there is help out there. So in very black and white terms, the expectation, as we've touched on, is that children are expected to be back in schools. That came into force back in August and for the delivery in September. And that's a really clear message that the DFE are still putting out there, and Health are saying, for children's well-being, if it is possible and it doesn't go against guidelines about COVID, then obviously children, where appropriate, are expected to be encouraged back into schools. In practically balancing that, the X code has been put in. As I've said, we don't want children in school who shouldn't be, and it makes very clear there in the guidance what that code is to be used for. Those 2 bullet points are there. I think you have to, when you're looking at the X code, just think about how you are applying that within your school. It is meant to be for the particular pupil on your school role. So if you apply that and think about it in that way, you'll be able to have a think about whether the X code is appropriate for some of those pupils and some of the scenarios that you've got going on. So for instance, if pupils have been asked to self-isolate, if they're in a bubble that's closed, if they're awaiting tests, if they've got symptoms, then yes, obviously the X code is going to be appropriate. Just being mindful, I think, in that usage, the attendance data, we're being told, will not be collected and published as it usually is for this coming year. However, in the school census coming up at the beginning of next year, the codes will be collected that haven't been previously. So just to be mindful, really, that as a school, it is likely that your code usage will still be looked at. And if you're unsure about the X code, please go back and revisit what the guidance says, because that will really help. Even when we do that sometimes and we reread things that have come out, in some instances we may be left feeling a little like this picture in front of you. I can assure you that I have some days, and I've spoken to a lot of schools who also assure me that they've got to this point. However, we use the arrows and we'll find a way through, as we always do. The first thing I would suggest that you do, if you've got some really tricky cases that you're not sure about, is revisit the attendance addendum information. Again, as previously, as I've kind of intimated, I'm very aware that schools have had an onslaught of information coming at them. And again, this might be something that got lost at the very beginning of coming back in September. And if you haven't recently re-looked at it, please do, because it will be very helpful, I think. It provides some examples and some scenarios of cases and coding. So if you haven't looked at that recently, it might be worth another 5 minutes to have a look through. Some really tricky cases I can give you examples of that perhaps are not covered by the X code. You may have a parent, one parent family who has got 3 children, and mom has been advised to self-isolate, as have 2 of the other children, but actually the 3rd child is still expected to attend school. And those are realistic, practical issues that if there is no support network or anything around that parent, you can see how, in trying to do the best, and as you are asked to do in terms of following public health guidance, there can be some really tricky kind of situations out there. Another example might be if you've got a child whose parents or sibling at home might be classed as extremely clinically vulnerable. And I know I've had a lot of conversations with head teachers at schools about exactly this. It's not officially covered by the X code because that particular pupil on your school roll is not the one that is classed as extremely clinically vulnerable. And I know that poses a lot of questions. Equally, if you've got parents or children with anxiety, we have some families in Worcestershire that are still genuinely petrified to go out of the front door. And I think what we need to be mindful of, that, you know, in these kind of scenarios, we make every effort we can to support and encourage and see what kind of networks might be out there and resources and initiatives that might provide a multi-agency approach to kind of help these kind of scenarios and families. Equally, I think we have to be pragmatic and realistic in the fact that in some instances, school attendance may not be the first concern or issue within that family, and you will know your families in your schools better than anyone. It remains, as it always has been previously, the head teacher's discretion regarding register coding. You may find for a small minority of cases that have really exceptional circumstances that as head teachers in schools may feel they wish to consider using other codes for this reason. And as long as I think, as always, a head teacher is able to justify that, it's something that's used on a short-term measure and is regularly reviewed, and doesn't go obviously against the legalities of register coding, then I think, you know, that remains in the head teacher's discretion to do so. Some things you might want to consider in those decisions, however, as schools, are the safeguarding duties. It doesn't disappear whatever code you use. So just to be mindful of that in safeguarding terms, it's still really important that the communication and contact with those families is still there to ensure that. Also, you may wish to consider, if you are thinking about coding under exceptional circumstances, the implications that then has about providing work for those pupils. If you're saying that you are in agreement that they are not to be in school, it may be that depending on what coding you're using, it also makes the implication that as a school you may need to be providing that. And again, there is no kind of one size fits all with that. Every situation will be different. And I think what is important in that, however, that the agreements and the plans are set in short term. They're very open and honest with parents. They manage everybody's expectations in that, and they are regularly reviewed. For the majority of cases that we are not able to get back into school at the moment, are likely, if they haven't got exceptional circumstances, to be classed as an authorised absence. And whilst we are understanding of many situations, and as schools, as I've said, you will know your children and families better than anybody, it may just be that this is how the absence needs to be coded. Pragmatically, as a school, you may decide that actually just because that child has got an authorised absence, it may not be appropriate to take any further action. And I think we have to be really minded in cases where attendance has previously not been any issue. The likelihood is the current situation, it has been the thing that's had some kind of impact. And I think we need to obviously be able to justify that by continuing to help and support and encourage as much as we possibly can. In a minority of cases, and I know that in starting to have conversations with schools more recently, I appreciate there may be some cases that you're considering whether they might need to be escalated or not. I hope to be able to share with you in the new year some information about what this might look like and what will be appropriate or what will be required. And again, this may or may not be dependent on if we get any further guidance from public health or DFE, and clearly we'll need to be driven by this. But we'll try and put something out in the new year that will assist schools in those kind of queries as well. So, what do we need to continue to be doing? There is nothing on there that I am certain you are not doing in schools already. You are continuing to do a fantastic job, and for the majority of pupils that are able to be in, you are managing that really well. I know that a lot of you are doing a lot of work about bubble returns, and instilling confidence in parents around that, because that can also have a bit of a knock-on effect in terms of perhaps people that weren't so worried about things may then start to be, as bubbles are expected to return, etc. I'm not going to go through all of those. You can obviously read through for yourselves. But I would just say continue to do the great stuff that you are doing. The things that are really proving successful for you in a school, share them as your good practice, because actually if you found something that works, if you share that with your staff and your parents, sometimes that is really powerful in kind of getting the message over. And it's not always the case that what might work for one will work in another situation, but it's certainly worth a try if you found something that seems to have had a really positive effect. I'm just going to share with you, when we get down to kind of creative solutions there as bullet point 4, I have seen in schools, I've been really privileged to be aware of some fantastic examples of what you are doing to secure attendance. And you are really driven by securing success in encouraging children back in when it's safe to do so. And these kind of examples are just exemplary of that. Some schools are talking through their risk assessments, in particular with parents and pupils that have maybe identified a specific barrier or specific issue to see if that can be unpicked further. Some schools are looking at different start and finish times, again, in addition to what they've already got in place in terms of staggered times. And that is helping with some pupils immensely in being able to kind of get them over a threshold again. Some schools are considering even smaller bubbles than the ones originally that they might have set up for particular children. And I appreciate that isn't always possible. But in the instances where we've seen that it does seem to have had a really, really powerful effect in being able to encourage pupils back into school. Peer-to-peer support, again, has been really useful, and I know a lot of that has been inevitably with children to children or young people to young people. I've also recently seen the most fantastic example of parent peer-to-peer support, where a school had utilised the fact that one of their parents that themselves were really fearful about returning their child to school in terms of anxieties around whether it was safe or not, have now with that school worked through that, and that particular parent is now sharing with others what their experiences were and how they kind of got through that, in the hope that for those parents that are still genuinely really anxious or concerned, it's a very powerful message for somebody from parent to parent. And just to say, yeah, you know, we're not kind of trying to make parents super spreaders in that. We're having to look at how that works virtually, and it does seem to be having a really good effect. And obviously parents may use platforms that aren't necessarily the same ones as schools, but in that instance it's been a really, really powerful tool and has made a massive difference. Again, just looking at contact with children that aren't in school for whatever reason, the sense of belonging that children have still it doesn't change, you know, and those, whether they're in school or not, feel the need to belong, even if it's just to see their peers and their friends. The legislation says that realistically some of those children don't need to be provided with work or contact, but I think again some schools are now looking at that more creatively to say, even though the legislation actually says we don't have to, if we are providing that anyway and it doesn't create any additional kind of workforce issues in terms of your staffing, etc., I think some of the schools are starting to consider whether that's a bit of a dangle for keeping those children connected and in, or maybe a way of getting them to come over a threshold if they haven't been already able to for whatever reason. And again, some of the other examples I've seen of intensive work with pupils and parents to find a route in and return children to school have been those that have tapped into external agencies, whether they might be education welfare or family support, whether they've been school health, whether they've been online kind of support tools that are out there, of which there are some fantastic ones, whether it's Back to School or the Educational Psychology Service. Those schools that have tapped into external support have found that actually their solutions have been quite creative, but they are finding some successes with those most tricky cases. So it might be that if you haven't already considered any of those, that might be something that you need to do. Those that are feeling those successes, thank you for continuing, because they are not easy wins, but they're a measure of your efforts and your successes in trying to encourage children back into school. And you know, as I said, I feel really privileged to be able to have seen some of that great practice out there. So to conclude, I just wanted to make you aware that new information will be sent out to schools as it is already through the bulletins, and keep an eye out for them. I know that the bulletins contain often lots and lots of info, and you might need to pick out sometimes the bits that are most relevant to you. But I just wanted also to make you aware that we have got some social media platforms that if it's something that you wanted to use, that they are there. They won't have all the bulletin information, but what they will have is our news and our information updates. They'll often have training event information and the most kind of prevalent points that are updates of that day. So if that isn't something you're currently signed up to and you think it might be useful for you, then by all means they're there, and I will provide them within slides that are provided. The links will be in there. Just to say, all the information today obviously comes from Education Welfare Support on behalf of Worcestershire Children's First within there. You may already know that schools, if you've already got a service level agreement with us, you will have a named EWO that you can contact for your concerns or queries. So please, yeah, do that. I know a lot of schools are finding that really helpful, just to have ad hoc conversations as they need to be, kind of as things arise. If you don't currently have a service level agreement with us and it's something that you might be interested in, then my contact details are there. Happy kind of to discuss that if that's something as your schools might want to be considering. Or alternatively, just to say that if as a head teacher you have any coding queries or really tricky case concerns, then please still do contact me. I'm happy to talk these through, and I can signpost you as best as I can as necessary. So that concludes the presentation today. I just want to say thank you again for coming back to revisit it and listening to the information shared today. I hope that you have found it useful. A lot of it, I appreciate, won't be new stuff, but is just worth kind of reflecting and perhaps revisiting on sometimes. I look forward to speaking with you all again in the new year. I wish you all the very best in continuing to do the great jobs with attendance that you are all doing and continue to do. And I'll say bye for now.